All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lucy Ehrenclue, and I am the City and County of Denver's Existing Buildings Programs Administrator. I'm excited to present this webinar called Boulder Commons Case Study, All Electric, Cost Effective. Just to go over some housekeeping things before we start, everyone is muted. We do welcome chats or questions in the chat or the Q&A box throughout the next hour. We'll answer those questions after our presenters speak towards the end of the hour. Lastly, this recording is going to be posted on Denver's High Performance Buildings and Homes webinar library and then sent out to all of the registrants in the next week or so. So first off, I just wanted to kick off today reminding everyone of the Energized Denver Awards, which were announced earlier on this month. We're encouraging folks who own, occupy, or have worked in some capacity with high-performing buildings in Denver to apply. Winning this award will position you and your company as a sustainable community leader as we work towards the city goal of net zero energy by 2040. Applications are due July 31st, and you can check out some of the categories in the slide and apply on the website that I'll put in the chat after we're done with the introduction. So you may have seen on the last slide that the last category is smart leasing. Smart leasing describes any action that aligns the interests of tenants and landlords to increase the overall health and energy performance of a building. Smart leasing practices can include anything from a green lease for sustainable building upgrades, a net zero energy lease, which we'll talk a little bit more about today, as well as an information disclosure clause in a lease, or even just tenant education about energy efficiency. These types of practices can really help building owners collaborate with tenants in order to comply with building performance and benchmarking requirements like the Energized Denver Ordinance. Smart leasing has a ton of benefits aside from reducing building-related greenhouse gas emissions. It will also contribute to increased occupant health and well-being, employee retention and productivity, as well as equipment resiliency, which will in the long run, provide financial gains and savings. This graphic is a more visual representation of a breakdown of financial savings that a company can expect to see from participating in smart leasing practices. This graphic and lots of other resources can be found on our webpage, and I'll go ahead and put that link in the chat in just a few moments as well. You can also find case studies, example energy-aligned lease clauses, and other informational guides for tenants, landlords, brokers, lawyers, and design experts. You can reach out to me via email if you have questions or you want to participate in the program as well. All right, so we have two really great speakers today. We have Bill Holicky, who is a principal from Coburn Architects, and Andy Bush, the founder of Morgan Creek Ventures. Bill is an architect with extensive experience in sustainable building design and has sat on multiple boards, including the City of Boulder's planning and affordable housing groups. His projects at Coburn have won awards from the EPA, from Historic Boulder, SunPower, and more. His specialties include planning, mixed-use projects, multifamily and affordable housing, retail, office, and breweries. We have Andy, who founded Morgan Creek Ventures in 2001, and the real estate and development and consulting group focuses on office and residential buildings. Andy focuses on developing models for other commercial builders developing in net zero buildings. The company specializes in LEED certified projects, as well as sustainable technologies in building management services, green roofs, solar installations, and water treatment. After our speakers present, as I mentioned before, we'll have time for a question and answer session. So please put any questions that you have in the Q&A box or the chat box to be answered at the end. With that, I'm going to hand it off to our speakers, Andy and Bill.
Great, thank you, Lucy. I think Bill's going to actually share the slide presentation, and we're going to kind of go back and forth in the process. But I think, and it's nice for Bill and I, we haven't done as many. We've each done a lot of different webinars and speaking as part of it. We haven't done all that much together in terms of the teaching or training side. And it's good to finally do this because Bill and I have now been collaborating for, it seems like almost a decade. I don't know that it's quite that long, but it's over a dozen all electric buildings, ranging from office to multifamily, and including retail first floor, kind of in mixed use neighborhoods. And so it's exciting to kind of talk together about what we've learned, some of it the hard way, on high performance buildings. So next slide. I think when we look at a strategy, and I think this is probably a collective strategy that we've developed over the last several years, for us personally as a company, we'll never develop a fossil fuel powered building again. We're kind of all in on all electric buildings, and we believe that they work in this climate quite well. We believe that they're suited for the rest of the climates in the country. I've been fortunate enough in the last several months to work with Urban Land Institute as a jurist for their national awards. And it's interesting how many of those are all electric in climates like Chicago and other places. So, but to do that, you've got to do really good, and we'll talk about this a couple times because it's worth repeating. You've got to have great building envelopes. You've got to do really good glass. You've got to do really good insulation. You've got to do good roofs. Kind of the building envelope is the piece that's going to be around for at least 50 years or more, and hopefully longer than that. And it really has to start with a great performing building envelope. And then we do solar. I'll talk a little bit. We're even doing some solar glass right now as part of it, but we look at energy production. But I would say that for me, I kind of look at the world a little differently than I did when we were trying to do our first highly sustainable buildings. I focus first on how do we create buildings that use as little energy as is practical. I'm a for-profit developer, but so we have to create a return on those. But we're trying to get down to where we're using in the mid 20 EUIs per square foot per year, or KBTUs per square foot per year. And that's a pretty low number. It's about a third of what most existing buildings are. It's a little less than half of what many current energy codes are. So first, kind of all electric for us. Second, uses a little energy as makes sense. Third, we look at on-site production. I'm not always sure buildings are the best place to produce solar energy or other kinds of energy, but we'll look at what's the most cost-effective way to do that. And then finally, we'll look at how we can manage and maintain those operationally, and both with new buildings and existing buildings. So next slide. This is an all-electric high-performance building. What it really is just a well-designed new building designed to kind of the current world. And our buildings, except for a few areas where we're doing vertical solar walls and things like that, don't really look much different than other buildings. But as you look at a building like this, it's different in the sense that there's lots of glass, there's lots of natural light, but each orientation has a different percentage of glass depending upon whether we're trying to let energy in from the sun or whether we're trying to keep heat in from the cold. So it changes all the time. Next slide. But you'll see the same kind of general feel is open, light colors, lots of glass in the right places. Next slide. So when we think about kind of energy consumption, and this is, as I said, I use energy unit intensity, EUIs, which really can also be translated into KBTUs. And we think of them in terms of per square foot per year. In 2003, we were using close to 100 EUIs per square foot per year. Average new building codes are down a little below 60, some like Boulder, and then we're getting even better than that. To create a net zero energy building, if it's producing all of its energy on site, what I would generally say is that those buildings need to be less than 3 or 4 stories tall, and they need to be in a climate with very good sun. I'm less concerned personally about whether we're producing all the energy on site. I'm more concerned in kind of that ultra low verified. Are we from there to kind of net zero energy? And people have different definitions of that. But I tend to think of net zero energy as either energy that's all produced on site or produced in a partnership where you're in direct partnership with that energy. I think others like ULI say if you're buying recs or offsets, that's also okay. And I don't kind of make judgments on that. I think the biggest thing is we need to create buildings and convert buildings so that they consume somewhere in that, in today's world, 20 to 25, maybe 30 EUIs per square foot per year. Next slide. So I showed this. This is just how it's one of the ways we looked at energy and what all electric system were we going to use for one of our buildings. And this is only part of the graph. And I did it more just to kind of point out that it's kind of complex. Sometimes it's very confusing. There's times that one option looks much better than the other. There's times when there's 3 or 4 that all look pretty good. And it does become kind of sorting the wheat from the chaff. And there are no clear winners. We use energy recovery units in most of what we do. Sometimes it's centralized and is on top of the building. Sometimes there's individual ERVs for individual residential units. And in the office world, it's usually some combination. So next slide. And this one's meant to make it look really complex. But the basic message here is we're trying to consume somewhere in that mid-20s in terms of EUIs per square foot per year. And that's done through a variety of things. We try to use narrow floor plates, which you'll see in kind of the upper right part of the graph, but we combine them and create kind of H-shaped buildings so we can get bigger floor plates. We tend to focus on different percentages of glass on different orientations, as I said earlier, and we'll look at different types of windows. And we've used quad pane windows, triple pane windows. They're filled with either argon or krypton gas, usually. All designed to really create a great thermal end. But when it really comes down to it, and Bill will talk about it probably a little bit more, what we're trying to do is capture the first, and kind of that bar graph on the left with the different colors, the first 10 kind of major different decisions. What kind of heating and cooling system, what kind of windows, what kind of envelope, what kind of lighting. And once you've made those first 8 or 10 decisions, the rest of it becomes a series of small decisions that, while important, aren't as important as those first 5 to 8. Next slide. So again, what's an average building in terms of consumption, kind of the gray piece on the left. And in this case, we were trying to get closer to net zero and saying the green on the far right is what we might be able to produce on site in that building. And the charts, the bar graphs in between are just different decisions. What if we use a slightly better window? What if we reduce air infiltration? We've developed a couple of tricks that help us really reduce air infiltration for a low cost. So all of those different decisions ultimately get you in that kind of, for us, our goal is generally mid-20s in terms of consumption. Next slide.
Andy, I'm going to jump in for 1 second. If you
Sure,
don't mind.
go ahead.
One thing that I want everybody to keep in mind as they look at this presentation is when Andy showed you the bar graph, and you're seeing some more here, right? The kind of bar chart. We're looking at trying to get from that gray bar down to the lower multicolor guy. I call it the pancake stack, right? Each one of those colors represents a different component of the building, what we're trying to do there. And we're looking at improving from, say, a mid-60s or a 57, 60 kind of EUI number down to something in the 23, 24 range. So everything we do, consider it an additive thing to the building or something that's in the base design, like narrow floor plates for lighting. We're looking at it on a cost benefit basis. Andy's a for-profit developer. He can't come up with the Apple headquarters that costs $800, $900, well, $1,200 a foot to build. He won't be able to sell it in the market or rent it in the market. So this is especially important with what Denver is trying to achieve. To bring this into the commonplace of the building practices, it has to be cost effective. So when you look at trying to improve your EUIs and get into a bar chart that's below that green bar on the right, which is what can be generated, in this case, that's a net zero building. Or if you're just trying to get to a high performance sustainability building, sustainability kind of building package, everything should be gauged on its EUI benefit or its improvement in the sustainability per dollar. So as we go through this moving forward, Andy's going to talk about office, I'll talk about residential. Think about that. Everything that we're doing in terms of decisions is a cost-driven decision.
And Bill will talk more about it. And if you can just hit the play button on this, I'm not sure exactly how you get it to play as a video. But all the decisions we're making, in this case, we extended the roof to get additional solar, but we also made that part of a beautiful 3,000 square foot outdoor deck that was designed for the tenant as part of it. So the decisions, the design decisions, and the sustainability decisions ultimately get merged together in a final design. This is 4 different buildings out of the dozen that Bill and I have worked on together. And there's similarities in each and differences in each. And they are that kind of collective sense of design decisions and sustainability decisions, all based on trying to create a building that performs in the marketplace and that I can create an institutional level return on. So next slide. And on that kind of building envelope, we've talked about it, but it is worth kind of talking about again, because if you don't do a good building envelope, it's really hard to get to a high performance building. And so for us, that means, as I said, generally narrow floor plates. We'll do 60 to 65 feet. But then we'll also attach those floor plates to each other, putting, say, common facilities like elevators, bathrooms, stairs in the middle so we can get to a bigger floor plate as part of it. All of our windows are at least triple glazed or more. The 2 buildings that we're showing here are actually quad pane windows. We've found a system called Aero Barrier that the best way to describe it, which isn't a great description, is it's kind of like a bug bomb. When you're doing a blower door test, you release this material and it goes in and finds all the cracks over 1/2 inch in. And we're essentially getting 50% reductions in air infiltration through this one simple process that costs about $1.50 to $2 a square foot. So it's a very cost-effective way to reduce air infiltration. And then we'll do things ranging from mineral wool on the exterior of a wall. Bill and I have also learned that if we use a higher quality window, we can use less insulation in the wall and get the same actual building performance. And it's actually better because those better windows reduce the convective heat movement and the thing that kind of makes a hair stick out on your arm, that goes away. And so it's a much more comfortable space for people also. Always LED lighting with good controls. And we've been using variable volume refrigerant systems for really all dozen buildings here. And we use them in different ways in different configurations, but it's been a really great way for us to do good envelopes and base systems. So next slide. And I guess, we tend to get sometimes caught up in the technology of this and forget about who's using it. And Bill and I will talk more about that. But what this does for an office tenant is it gives them dependable energy. It gives them a design that helps them in recruitment and retention. It allows those, the way we structure our leases, and I'll talk briefly about that later, those who use more energy pay for more energy as part of it. And I think that we're really seeing tenants feel as though they're getting increased productivity from everything from conference rooms that actually hold their temperatures and are comfortable to be in, to better daylighting, better lighting. We do better filtering. We're using MERV 13 filters in most of our buildings. And if an energy in terms of or in a client, in terms of our lease structure, if they stay on their energy target, which we'll talk about, they're really not paying for any additional energy. So it saves them money in the long run. Next slide. So again, kind of simple, but leading edge systems, not bleeding edge systems. VRF technology, we use energy recovery units, good building envelopes on the plumbing side. Bill will talk a little bit more about it on the residential world, but we're using on-demand instantaneous water heaters for office because we don't use that much water. On the residential side, we're starting to use some pretty interesting energy recovery systems that, as Bill says, gives us a lot of bang for the buck as part of it, and good controls on the electrical side. And then we are doing enhanced infiltration or air filtration, looking at MERV 13 as kind of our base minimum and improving air quality for everybody who's in the buildings. Next slide. I'm going to let Bill talk a little bit about solar.
Yeah, so that brings us a little bit to the base design. And one of the interesting things is that we're all doing this in an urban context. If you're out in the field, you can flip a building around, change the building, change the footprint, modify the layout to make it ideal. But we don't have ideal sites. We have the urban sites that we have. So one of the first things we do when we get a site is we look at what are the constraints, what are the benefits, what are the possibilities, and what's going to make it difficult for us. This is the building you've been looking at. And an interesting thing about this particular building was that we had a railroad track to the east. And so no building was ever going to be built on the east side of this. So we started to look at doing the things that Andy and I talked about, narrow floor plates. There was 3 to 4 story buildings that are ideal for solar. I know there's a question on that. We can talk more about why that's ideal, but generally what it means is that we're getting a lot of solar per square foot. At the same time, we have a fairly square building envelope, so our heat and cooling load isn't dominating the building more than it needs to. So again, in the Q&A, maybe we get into that in more detail, but I think this is the important thing to note is that the first step when you get your building is look at where you can make headway and where it's going to be challenging. Try to minimize the challenging part. If you look at the right-hand slide, the building on the top is sort of shaped like a U, and that's purposeful. If we would have made that a big square, we would have had a lot of trouble getting natural light to the core of that building. And as you saw in those pancake charts, the lighting is a big driver for EUI, somewhere between 4 and 12 on the EUI chart, depending on the building. So this helps us minimize that, but we're trying to still get solar on the building. You can see, I think Andy had a slide earlier that said generally you're trying to get to a usage of about 20 to 21 EUI for a normal net zero building. And we were about 25, so we needed more solar. This is a solar intensity study. It tells you how much light is falling on any portion of the building at any given time. And then it runs it for the whole day, and it'll tell you how many kilowatts it can generate. Bright yellow is good, purple is bad. Then you can see the rows of bright yellow, so that's great. But the interesting part is this, on this left-hand picture, on that eastern side, it's a pretty good intensity. And that's because the light is unbroken as it comes up from the eastern side. And on this slide, you can see north is the street as it goes up to the top of the page. That's due north. So these face a little bit south. So because of that, we were getting really good solar intensity on that wall. So we had this thought, hey, we should put solar there, and it was very expensive, very challenging. There's not a lot of vertical solar out there. So we started thinking about, are there other ways to pay for the solar? Andy came up with this other idea. He looked at, hey, what if we look at the solar for this building as its own investment vehicle, essentially? So what can we get out of it? What can the return be? What is the cost? So we sort of looked at that as a model. Cost was still too high, but what we finally figured out was we could use the solar panels as the building cladding. So while solar panels cost about $80 a foot to put on the outside of a building, we're eliminating a metal panel that costs $40 or $50 a foot. So that drove the cost of the solar way down. Now we're putting that solar panel on the outside of the building for something like $30 a foot on a net add cost basis. And when you look at the kilowatts that are generated out of that panel, they're not as good as what's on the roof because it's not quite as high of a solar intensity. But if you look at that generated solar energy on a watts per dollar, it's actually as good or maybe even a little bit higher. So the invested dollars in that solar system on the vertical wall, because we can eliminate the paneling, the metal paneling, is actually giving us a pretty good return. So then we got to figure out how to put it on the outside of the building. So this is an example, again, this isn't a solar presentation, but it's an example of how you can use the systems that are in place in creative and thoughtful ways and not just throw money at a building. So the core of the building on the left, that's the structure, then we insulate it and sheath it, and then this thing sits on top, that solar sits on top of it as a way to clad the building, and it's essentially a rain screen. And this kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of how that's built up from a section standpoint. And then the final product looks like this. This was our first try at this, and there aren't any systems that really exist. So we did the whole thing with bent in place and custom metal pieces, really unistrut all over the place. We have some better systems for it now as we've done the next few buildings. I would say two things that we're learning. One is how to put it up on the building more cost effectively, and the other is from a design standpoint, how to integrate it into the design in a more cohesive way. This really kind of had a glass and solar panel pattern that broke up and changed across the building. We're pretty pleased with it. But moving forward, we figured out how to use it more like a metal panel. So it's just in the design of the building. So that's a big deal, because as we look at the plug loads, we're trying to offset that with solar, right? And the higher plug loads we have, the more solar we need. So we just kind of walked through how we got this wraparound on the solar. That gave us about 25 EUI worth of solar. But now we had to drive down the plug loads. That's where Andy's green lease comes in. So I'll let him take over here and he can walk you through how that worked.
Yeah, and let's keep that slide up for a minute. In that, the average office building in the U.S. uses in plug loads about what we use in total energy for our buildings. Now, that number has actually come down a little bit over the last couple of years. But we went out and we looked at some of the best buildings that were around, and it seemed like 7 EUIs per square foot as a plug load. And that's, everything you plug in. It's computers, it's copiers, it's refrigerators, it's those kinds of things. And tenants can really control that. So we said, let's set 7 as a base number. And if you use less than 7, you don't pay anything for energy. We monitor it. If you use more than 7, we treat it kind of like an industrial lease or industrial gross lease. It's essentially anything above that you pay for. And that was a process that made sense in terms of current utility laws. It's really just us recapturing it and passing it through to a tenant. We also in our lease said, if the tenant uses more than the 7, then we're going to ask them to buy renewable energy certificates to offset that. So we're still staying green and sustainable in our energy all the way through the process. We monitor each tenant on a continuous basis. We report back to them on a quarterly basis. We kind of settle up on an annual basis. And so we have, as part of our lease, really made plug load kind of the major component. We've also required all Energy Star appliances. You can't bring in old copy machines, old others into our new building. You have to demonstrate as a tenant that they're all Energy Star. Next slide. We have on the lease, and Rocky Mountain Institute, who is really our partner on the lease, has done a really good abstract, and you can find it on their websites. And I think we even have a redacted version in there as part of it. But as I said, it started with this kind of base plug load allowance, RECs to offset any overages. We do annual commissioning. I'll be honest, we went a little light on that during COVID. Number one, it was hard to commission with people not in buildings. And number two, our energy use kind of dropped as people weren't there. But the goal was to have at least a technical net zero energy requirement, which meant that the building produces X amount of power in the 20 EUIs per square foot. The consumption on average is in the mid-20s, and people pay for the power that they use above that. Now, we as the landlord also pay for the energy in common spaces that's above the base load as part of it. So we do have a way that technically everyone's net zero energy, and at the same time, someone can come in and most of our tenants have their servers in the cloud. We have a couple of tenants who have their servers on site. They almost by definition use sometimes twice as much energy as everyone else. So it's another way to make it kind of fair for everybody who's participating in the process. We have full disclosure as part of it. And we do have a real kind of wide variety of occupants, from salons to data companies that are crunching a lot of data with on-site servers and multiple screens per person. So you have to create a lease framework that is flexible enough to allow each company to be who they are, to try to do better than they've done before, and then to reconcile that in a way that, in our case, was using RECs as kind of an equalizer, as well as them paying their additional energy use and consumption over time. Next slide. Like Bill's going to talk a little bit more about what we've done on the residential side.
Yeah, so this is next to the building that Andy was showing before. And so we did a few net zero office buildings in a row and then flipped over to a net zero residential building. And one of the things we learned is that residential buildings are just quite a different animal than office in a lot of ways. And it's fundamentally the way the building's used that changes them. They're not occupied just during the day. So things like nighttime flush, which was a really hot thing to do maybe a decade ago in office, cannot be done in residential. There's much more variance in the heating and cooling loads. People have a real desire to be personally comfortable at home in a way that they don't necessarily do in the office. There's a sense in the office that, you know, the temperature is sort of the collective temperature, but at home you want to have more control over your personal space. You tend to open your windows and doors more. One of the biggest differences is the domestic water, the hot water. In an office setting, there is hot water need. It's limited. At home, you take showers, you cook, and there's a much higher hot water load. Hot water is very energy consumptive to heat. So that's a big part of our decisions. There isn't a centralized manager. In an office building, you have one group that's managing it. Angie just kind of explained how those green leases work. That is much, much harder to sort of implement and manage in a residential setting than it is in a building with 3, 4, even 8 tenants. And you have independent users, right? An office is a collective user. That group is using energy together. You do your reporting to them. They work as a group to change that. But in an apartment building or a condo, everyone's doing their own thing, which makes it much more difficult to manage. And then lastly, it's always occupied. And that's a fundamental difference between an office building and a residential building. So here's an example of a residential pancake charter or bar graph. And you can see that there's different loads, different energy loads that dominate that. We have a much, from the bottom of the blue down is really the difference. So we have a much higher domestic water load. That's that dark maroon color, that dark rust color. The heating load is also higher because in an office building, you're generating heat from machines, from people, all those things during the day. At night when it's colder, generally people aren't there. So office buildings are often cooling load dominated in our climate, but residential buildings are mostly heating dominated. So you have much higher heating load. Your lighting load is much higher. People want much more control as to where their light is when they have it on, and they're using it at night. So the lighting is in much higher demand. And your plug loads include not just office equipment, which you can have a program for. Actually, Andy has talked about implementing, may have already implemented a program where people can get low-cost loans to replace energy hog office equipment. But with a residential program, you just can't do that. So people have whatever they bring to it. And at the same time, we're still trying to create wonderful spaces for people, right? Because they're living there. They can't go home at the end of the day. They're in whatever space we're giving them. So the way we handle those things, the way we attack those things, first of all, is by misspelling the word components, apparently. But after that, we are we're looking at it a little bit differently. So we're trying to lower down or create a reduced water load wherever we can. So low flow fixtures are critical. We want to then modify that. So let's talk about water for a second. Water is a really big heat sink. It takes a lot of heat to heat it up, and once you have the heat in there, it holds on to it. So even after you take a shower, the water that's going down the drain is very hot water. So if you can recap that water and put it back into the next water that you're sending out to the units, it's a big energy recovery strategy that has a large impact. So we have a system that we've been using called by a company called Shark, and the system itself is called a Piranha. And what it uses is a centralized hot water system that's based on heat pumps. It sends the hot water out to all the units. Then that water comes back to it, and there's a heat recovery system in there. So it gets the water, the heat back out of that wastewater and uses that to drive the cold water that's coming in through a heat exchanger, and without, of course, crossing the water streams. It's pre-warming the water that's coming in on the domestic side. So instead of an input water temperature of 55 degrees, we're hoping for an input water temperature of 70, 80, 90, depends on the time of year. It depends on who's using the water and how long it's been used. That's a huge jump. I mean, we're reducing our energy need to heat that water by 40% or more. So when we talk about impact per dollar, that is a really high impact per dollar. we have to be really careful with how we light the space. People really want to have the ability to turn on lights and see everything, whether they're cleaning or they're working on books, that kind of thing. So of course, task lighting is great, but the overall lighting has to be well designed. It can be energy efficient as all get out, but if you don't have the lighting distributed spatially well within the room and people have dark corners, then they're going to overlight the space. So it's really important to get the lighting plan right. Light only where you need it, don't overlight anything, and make sure everything is accessible for light when people need it. The space heating and cooling needs to be a bit more flexible. In an office building, you typically set it and forget it. People like to come home when it's cold out, maybe turn the heat up. In the summer, they might turn the heat down. So a system that can be flexible for different users is something that's really valuable. The VRF system in this regard is really good in that way, because you can have some units in heating and some units in cooling, and it will use the waste heat generated from the cooling to heat the units that are too cold. And I won't go through all of these, but those are some of the bigger ones. That tight envelope and aero barrier that Andy talked about is a really huge deal. Then we look at how each unit is using energy, and that's both for occupant education, which is a big component of it, driving down the plug loads, but also so that we can learn. As Andy said, we've done about 12 buildings now, and we keep referring to each one as, the strategy is the 2.0 strategy or the 2.1 strategy or the 3.0 strategy, right? We're constantly trying to build on what we've learned over time. One other really nice thing, as Andy mentioned, if you get up to a certain level for Windows, right around R6, and we've done R6 and R8 windows, they are tremendously impactful. One of the things it does is it cuts out that convection current, as Andy mentioned. So in other words, you don't get air cycling at the window. That air cycling at the window decreases the perceived temperature by like 4 or 5 degrees, which is enough to make you cold even if the temperature is warm. So the high quality windows eliminate that and make people feel more comfortable, even though the energy being used to heat the space is the same. And in the end, as you can see from these pictures, what we're trying to do is create really high quality units. They don't look like they're coolers or insulated boxes. In reality, they are, but they feel like really high quality buildings. Back to Andy.
And I'm going to do this really quick because we want to try and make sure that we've got time for Q&A. But new buildings are easy, and easy in the sense that we're getting pretty good at them. It's off the shelf technology. We're leading edge, but we're not bleeding edge. It's been done enough that, I believe everybody should be doing these kinds of buildings for new buildings. And I don't think the cost is that much greater. And you get back the returns in terms of reduced cap rates and better rents and sales. Existing buildings are a little bit different because as we retrofit, we've got existing envelopes. And I think that's one of the biggest problems. And so really making sure that you use great windows on the retrofit side they're even more important on the retrofit than they are in a new building. And there are starting to be some technologies that allow us to not have to re-insulate the whole building. There are some drywalls out there that you can pick up some pretty good R values with a 1/2 inch of drywall material. And you can use things like aero barrier as part of it. LED retrofits for lighting are pretty easy. Water conversions are easy. The hard part is really converting the heating and cooling systems themselves, especially if you're in office buildings and you have existing tenants who have non-disturbance rights and things like that. So it's complicated, but we're starting to figure out ways to do that. Next slide. And here, I think one of the big things to think about is just as we convert these buildings, if all we do is convert them to electric with the same building envelope, we're going to create some grid issues. An all-electric building that uses 70 or 80 EUIs per square foot is going to create some problems. A lot of natural gas has kept a lot of electricity use off the grid as part of it. As we start putting these new renovated buildings onto the grid, we've got to make sure that they're good buildings. Next slide. So again, envelopes are the key. Most of it's done through windows and roofs. We're starting to be able to do certain things on the wall side. and really make sure that we're reducing consumption, not just converting to 80 or 90 EUIs of all electric use. Next slide. And I think this is, Bill and I talk about this a lot, is just sometimes we get into the technical side of designing these buildings, and you can go to the next slide. I want to make sure we don't forget about the fact that these buildings are occupied by people, whether they're office buildings, whether they're residential buildings. And I think we've got to make those spaces better for people. Both it's kind of our obligation as developers and designers, but it's also our obligation as building owners and for kind of just the future. So we need to improve occupant comfort, which we're doing both in the office and residential side. We're improving air quality, both in terms of, I was talking about MERV 13 filtering, but going to induction ranges, not kind of this, these aren't your grandparents' electric ranges. These are really wonderful ranges. But if you look at indoor air quality on the residential side, gas versus induction range is probably the single biggest change you can make to benefit people's lives. And I think we talk a lot about buildings that open to the outside and have a dialogue with the environment. These aren't hermetically sealed boxes. They're places that air and light come in and out of as part of it. And daylight means a lot. And the outdoor spaces that are semi-private spaces or public courtyards, all of that matters. And I think we need to start rewarding the people who live there for being in a good building in terms of, as we've done on the office side, reduce costs of operation if you can maintain your actual plug load as part of it. We're starting to look at those same things for residential occupancy. Next slide. So again, these spaces are spaces for people. And next slide, they have to be designed that way. They have to be designed. This is pre-COVID. We used to have great public gatherings. We're not quite back at that level in some of what we're doing, but we use our lobby spaces and other spaces for the community, for art. Next slide. It's important to have spaces that people can enjoy and be part of, and to think about everything from comfort to air quality and health and wellness as we start looking at these buildings. They offer a lot of advantages. Next slide.
One thing I'll add to that is, let's just play pretend for a moment and say, hey, we just invented a way to have unlimited, perfectly clean energy. There are still things within the sustainability design movement, within what we're doing, that would bring an enormous amount of benefit to people in the community. And this is one of the things we ask ourselves all the time. Are we just doing net zero? Are we just doing highly sustainable? Or are we also sustaining the community? So for example, really high quality design is of paramount importance to us. We don't want it to look like it's a net zero building. We want it to be wonderful architecture, great design, support the street, create places for people, and all of those things. But as Andy mentioned, some of the aspects of this are things that we've always had as a species historically and are critical for our survival. The access to outdoor light. If you have outdoor light and it's abundant and it's clear what time of day it is, you're a much, much happier person than if you're in a room with very little light or no light at all, like interior conference rooms used to be designed. If you have access to fresh air, you're going to feel connected to the outside. If you feel that you have, one of the nice things about a highly insulated building is that it's really sound dampened, so you feel protected in it. This building happens to be next to a railroad track. When we started the project, Andy's old office was next to a railroad track, and we literally had to stop our conversations in the conference room when the train went by. And now you can't even tell when it goes by, right? So that's sort of protective space for people. There's a space here. I'm going to flip to the next slide, Andy, quick. This space actually doubles as a mobility hub. Our entrance to the parking garage is below. That's where the bike share is. That's where pickup and drop off for Lyft are. And so this is the way to get around with alternative methods, but it also happens to be where everybody gathers. That's where the bike path is literally coming right between these two buildings. So it's an awesome community gathering spot. Every time when Andy was officed here, every time I would go to visit her for a meeting, there was that sense of community when you walk through the space. You see people and know people from other buildings and offices because everybody comes through this one area. So I guess I just wanted to point out that we're not just running digits, saving energy, or making math work. We're also trying to create buildings that support communities. And that's a big difference. So even if we somehow snap our fingers and solve the energy problem tomorrow, we're still solving community issues with the way we're making space. So
Yeah,
Andy,
these
I'll turn it back
spaces,
over to you.
yeah, these spaces are public spaces. They serve the buildings, but they serve the community. We don't try to decide who comes in and who comes out. And in fact, the more people that are there, the more animated, the safer, the more enjoyable the space is. You know, we have to fight a little bit on putting skateboard bumps on some of the seating and other stuff, but that's just, again, good design. We don't want to keep people out. Next slide. And this one I'm not going to go through, but the point is there's starting to be some pretty good data on what these buildings do for people, and whether it's increased productivity, whether it's shorter stays in hospitals, whether it's better mental function, whether it's happier people. We know that kids test better in school with better daylight. It's hard data to gather, but people are starting to gather that data. And so we did an analysis for one of our tenants, and if they got, I think it was a collective 3% improvement. We said if you get 1% improvement in productivity, 1 in retention, and 1% in employee attraction, your base rent is almost free. That's how important people are to businesses and in their well-being and productivity. So next slide. And what's next? And we're going to make sure we have time for Q&A, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I'll tell you, there's a couple. We try to do something interesting with each new building. And on one of the last buildings, we're doing a solar film in the window. And we put film in all of our windows. Usually it's to reject the heat and bounce it back off. In this case, it's a solar film that absorbs the solar energy and produces solar energy. You see through it. It's about 70% transparent, like most of our windows, 60 or 70. So it looks just like any other window that we have, but it produces energy. A normal solar panel is about 4% efficient. This is only about 6% efficient right now. They think they can get to about 12, but it might cost half as much as a solar panel. So that's a pretty interesting idea of what's next for mid-rise and high-rise buildings. I don't know, Bill, do you have a what's next?
Yeah, I think that one of the things you just said, I want to harp on a little bit. We're not designing like I said, a $2,000 a square foot showpiece. We're trying to design real buildings for real people and real developers. So what we're trying to do is learn. And every time we learn, we're trying to push it a little bit further. Each building, things change, right? So the technology that's available changes. The tradespeople actually get more skilled at certain things. When we first started doing VRF, there were very few mechanical contractors in the state that were very comfortable with it to give us good pricing. And now it's become much more prevalent in Colorado. It had been prevalent in California, for example, for years and years, but Colorado is catching up. So as we learn, as the systems change, as the cost of things change, you've all seen the cost of construction kind of blow up in different areas. It changes the equation. So what we're trying not to do is say, okay, we got it figured out, we're going to replicate that. Each time we start a project, we're trying to take it another level further. So maybe it's just refining the package we had. Maybe it's to tackling something else. And I think Andy and I are both interested in some of the things. Andy's talking about the technology around glazing, which we're both kind of fascinated with. I'm really fascinated with how people interface with buildings and how people interact with them and what can be done in that regard to change the amount of energy the building uses and the sort of the satisfaction that somebody has in the space. I think the big change moving forward, or some of the big changes are, you can look at where technology is driving change and you can kind of guess what's coming next. And a lot of what's happening is in the consumer sector. It used to be in the building sector, we would buy upgraded materials and they would sell to designers and developers and contractors. And now so much of the investment is on the consumer side through Google products and Amazon products and other products like that. I think once they start to get interested in energy use, which is really just starting, and somebody can go to Best Buy and buy a $50 thing and plug it into their wall, and that will gauge how much energy they're using, I think we'll start to gamify sustainability. And as soon as you gamify something, it changes rapidly for the better. So I'm excited for when that's going to happen and how that's going to happen. And we're already starting to do it in the buildings. Andy has, and a lot of net zero buildings have monitors so people can see what they're using and how the building's performing. It starts to gamify things. Andy, I think you at one point were having some contests for who could use the least amount of energy in a month. And those things are attracting people to the problem. When we get people invested in the problem, the solutions start to change. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Great. And Lucy, I think we'll turn it over to you for Q&A.
Awesome. Well, great presentation. Thank you both so much. We do have quite a few questions. So if we don't get to your question, I will put that in the email that I send out to all of our registrants as well. So, or put the answer out in that email. So no worries if we don't get to your question here in the live session. But I'm going to start off with two we have in the chat. The first one is, what are the funding sources to make these types of projects?
I'll let you go, Bill. We can alternate to try.
Well, I think I'll turn that one over to you, Andy, because you're the funding guy. So why don't you tackle that one first?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we're pretty traditional from a funding standpoint. We use the same equity ratios as most developers do. We're trying to produce institutional returns, which for us are 150 basis points over cost, 5.5, 6 cash on cash return and 11% plus IRRs. We're not swinging for the fences. We use institutional financing, predominantly life insurance financing. And what we found is we're getting better rates, probably 20 or 30 basis points better than they give somebody else because of the fact that they believe in the asset and that it's a lower risk for them. And I'd say that when we look at appraisals, we're getting anywhere from 25 to 50 basis point lower cap rates in our going in cap rates from appraisers. So traditional financing, we're getting a slightly better deal because of the buildings we're doing. Great.
Another question is, what prevents high-rise offices from reaching net zero energy, and what has to change to get there? It's kind of a big question.
I can tackle that one.
That's an easy one.
Yeah, it's an easy one. I got the gimme. Essentially, we're generating solar off the roof for most of our building stock across the country, right? And so that only generates a certain amount per ground square foot that it sits above. So if you layer in one floor, it's generating an awful lot of renewable energy for that one floor that it sits above. If you put 30 floors underneath it, it's only doing 1/30th of that per square foot that it sits above. So really you have to look at high rises differently. It's very, very challenging to do on-site energy generation on a 10-story building. It almost always requires off-site generation of some kind.
Great. Next one, how do you go about calculating the cost benefit of sustainable features? I would assume that's compared to traditionally or not traditionally sustainable features, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's parts of it that are easy and there's parts of it that are hard, is kind of the honest answer. That we start with a really good building envelope and good windows, and we kind of build that into our base design. So that's not something we're comparing to an average envelope and poor windows. So we start with a good envelope and we kind of say that's necessary. And we don't do a lot of cost benefit on that envelope itself. But when it gets into individual features, and Bill and I do it all the time, the difference between an R8 window and an R6 window, we tend to look at the world in terms of EUIs per square foot. If that saves us half an EUI and the cost difference is $200,000, we may not do it. We looked at sunshades on the first buildings that we did, and they cost us a couple $100,000 and gave us 3/4 of an EUI. We thought it was better off putting the money someplace else as part of it. The Shark Piranha, the wastewater capture, heat capture product that Bill talked about, there we're saving 4 to 5 EUIs, and it might cost us $300,000. That one makes a lot. So for us, it's what does it do for the occupant? Because we also look at occupant comfort and what we're giving for them. But generally, it's kind of a hard-nosed dollars per EUI decision once we get beyond a base envelope.
And I'll add one thing because this is such an important topic. Everything Andy said, and then also looking at how the the things interrelate to each other. So if you look at a typical office building with sheet glass on it, the glass is expensive and it performs poorly from a sustainability standpoint. If you do punched openings like these buildings have, the glass, that poor performing, very expensive material, is minimized, and a much better performing, much cheaper material, the wall, is maximized. So if you look at those two things together, you can start to tune the building base. And this is what Andy was saying. We just kind of do this as our starting point. You can actually save money and perform better. Another example, putting your stairwells on the outside of a building and putting glass in them. People won't use the elevator. They'll want to use the stairwells. And so you'll save money for free, save energy for free. So.
Great. And then next up we have Brian says, when I lived in the South Pacific, all power outlets had a switch on the outlet itself to limit power losses. How is this being applied in the States? I don't know if you two have seen that.
I've seen a little bit. I'll let Bill talk about kind of power monitoring, what we are and aren't doing. I would say we're taking a more simplistic approach.
Yeah, you know, the trickle charge or trickle loss is, it's a deal. But it's not the major component that's driving plug loads to 20, right? That's really the equipment itself. And so this is what I was talking about earlier when I was saying when the gamify or the consumer side catches up, this is going to change. There's really no reason that equipment can't have a trickle charge preventer on it. It should have a self limiter. And so if you look at a copier from 10 years ago versus a copier now, the latent load loss is a fraction of what it used to be. So we are providing people in some units with things like a hotel switch. So you walk out of your unit, you can flip a switch and your whole unit turns off. And that would shut off any outlets connected to that and eliminate trickle charges. But we're not policing that so much as we're trying to lower the overall use and modernize the equipment. And that makes a pretty big difference.
Yeah, and I would add to it that sometimes you have to jump ahead from a technology standpoint. And I think Bill was kind of saying that the cost of us to go out and even do that hotel kind of switch and wire it back into everything and make sure that your refrigerator stays on and your heat stays on is very expensive. And it's an area where technology is jumping there faster than the hardwired system. So where we feel like there's a coming technology that's going to be there through other means in the next 3 to 5 years, we're usually skipping over and waiting for that jump to occur, unless it's a big EUI consumer.
Great. So we have time for probably 2 more quick questions. And the first one is, how do you balance the need for enhanced ventilation, for example, to mitigate risk for viral infections with preserving the envelope to conserve energy?
Bill, I'll let you take that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I could use up the next hour on that, so I won't. You know, essentially we're using energy recovery ventilators, and there's multiple schools of thought, but the thing that we are subscribing to is that it's best to bring in, have a super tight envelope where your incoming air temperature is uncontrolled, and replace that with a controlled incoming air that can be fresh and it can be filtered and it can be tempered. And so we're using energy recovery ventilators, which capture a big portion of the energy loss when that air comes in. And then we are, because of COVID, looking really seriously at indoor air quality. And the buildings that we've done together over the last 5 years have a real variety of solutions to that. We know we need to solve for viruses. We are not sure what the best answer to that is. The building that I'm sitting in right now, for example, has UV filters in it. We have high quality MERV filters in some of the buildings. I think a lot of those are unproven in terms of COVID, but again, better to have it than to not. So best practices are changing. And this is an example, like you said, what's next? Solving indoor air quality is probably one of the biggest things that we're all working on. And I don't think we have answers yet.
Yeah, and I'd say that CO2 monitoring is probably one of the next big steps. And most building owners should realize that if they don't do it, their tenants are going to do it with their iPhone. And you can now buy a monitor for $100 that plugs into a phone.
All right. And so for our last question, ending on a good note, Tom asked, when will we see a net zero Denver Commons development? We need some net zero energy love over here.
That's a good one. Coming soon. No, I would say that we are exploring Denver. Bill's already very active in Denver and designing buildings down in that area. and that's a place we haven't found a specific site, but we've really started to look for different sites as part of it. So might not be that far away.
Our emails are up on the screen. If you have a piece of land that's good, let us know.
Yeah. If you have a good site, let us know. We're interested in a Denver solution.
All right, awesome. Sorry I couldn't get to everyone's questions. I will put the last 5 or so in an email and answer them for you. And I'll send this link, those questions out in the next week. But thank you so much, Andy and Bill, for talking to us today and helping us learn about this awesome development in Boulder. Thanks to our viewers for joining us today. And don't forget to register for our next webinar, Paying for Commercial Building Upgrades, CPACE, on Wednesday, July 27th at 12 p.m. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks all.